Okay, so we're recording. My voice is really loud on this, so let me turn it down. There we go. Hopefully that's better. Has anybody been watching these videos? Is the audio absolutely terrible, or is it okay?
It's alright, like it's kind of low sometimes, especially if you step away, like you're usually just talking to somebody else who's just tired.
Yeah.
Like if you step away too far, I mean, you don't hear it at all.
I need to just watch through one and like kind of hear it. Like when I look at the peak levels on this, it like was spiking out to red, and I'm like, I don't want to be all like through the whole thing. You know, like I wanted it to be able to be understandable.
Usually when you're like right there, like behind the white desk, that's like your best spot.
Oh, really? Okay, like right here. So teach from here.
I mean, that's what we're saying anyway, so.
No, that's cool. Hopefully these are helpful. I'm trying to do this actually for all of my classes. So if you actually are on that YouTube page, you'll see that there's a video for each of these. Like for my 3D animation class, I record a video for both sections of it. So like I go through the same lecture twice. And really it's just so you have too much information, right? Like you always have an answer that you can dig for if the question comes up at 2 a.m. when I'm sleeping, because I am totally sleeping at 2 a.m. So how many of you got a chance to play around with the rig? What'd you think?
It sounds good, I love your little UI. I think it's so cute and it's self-important.
So that was like one of the first things. I think it was Cameron said that like the UI. Like, oh, no wait, somebody was telling me they really liked the GUI. I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was you. There was a couple people mentioned that, right? That if you got a chance to play around with the face, you're like, oh, that's cool. Like it's like a joystick for it. Now I'm not the one who designed this rig. I wish I could take credit for it. This is a free one from the internet, and a lot of times in the classes for character animation, I try to provide a handful of rigs that I've made that are sort of specifically for those projects. But there are so many free rigs out there. So I thought we'd start a little bit by talking about rigs, and then I'm going to hop into that Hobo rig, and we'll talk about it. So there's a handful of great places where you can find free rigs to just play with, right? If you're really digging animation, like I know so many people who are like, I want to animate. So I started modeling a head, and then I extruded down the neck, and then like 6 months later, I was able to set a keyframe, right? No, there's so much stuff out there. If you want to animate, practice animating. Don't practice rigging. Sure, rigging, modeling, all of those things are good, right? But what's going to happen is there's so many steps along the way that you're going to struggle with that by the time you get to animation, like you'll have spent so much time on all that other stuff, you'll be tired of that character and not want to animate anyway. So there's some great rigs out there. Some of the places to find them, I'll tell you like some of the main places that we're seeing recently. There's a place called Animation Buffet. Buffet has one T in it apparently. And it's just a blogspot page that he updates periodically with different character rigs. And it is just page after page after page after page of different rigs, right? There's a handful of rigging artists who release a lot of rigs either for free or cheap. So you'll see names like Josh Sobel or I think his name's I'll have to look at him here. It's this guy here. So more info here. Yeah, Truong CG. So this guy has a Gumroad page and a Patreon page, and he releases probably 3 to 4 rigs a month. Like you will, if you go to Portfolio, you will see these rigs popping up everywhere. Most of them are free or under $10. He has I think a Patreon page that you can support. That if like it's like $5 a month or something like that, and you get access to all of the rigs, plus videos of how he made all of the rigs. Like there's just a lot of free rigs out there. The Hobo rig's actually been around for a long time, and there are several rigs that you'll sort of stumble across that are free on the internet that have been around for a while. Some are better than others. And so I usually like to endorse this guy primarily because I know that his rigs work, right? Because there's nothing really stopping anybody out there who has a copy of Maya from opening up Maya, making a terrible rig, and providing it to you to get halfway through an animation and realize it doesn't work right. Yes?
What kind of rig would that be?
So I think some of this is props as well. He may have some motion stuff on this. But yeah, this is low poly forest. I think this is more just like a scenery for it. Although he does have some stuff, or for some of your animations, I think he does have some stuff that is not a character rig, that is more like a prop rig. Yeah, it's just page after page. We're not at the bottom, believe it. Well, maybe we are. Are we? So, so yeah, there's lots of stuff in here, and you will see a lot of these as the semester goes along. Have fun with this, right? If you're enjoying animation, if you're enjoying playing around with these rigs, just download these, or download a few of them and just start playing with it, right? The hard part at this point is familiarity with the concept of how you're going to control your rig, right? So that was one of the first things I wanted you to do, was just hop in there, start messing around with the Hobo rig and seeing what each control does, right? In character animation, one of the questions I get the most is like, or not questions, one of the comments is like, oh, I couldn't make his toe bend. And I'm like, it's in there, it just may not be in the spot you thought it was. Or people will think there's not a control for something, and it turns out there is, it's just sort of hidden in a way. And so what you did when you were familiarizing yourself with the rig is probably one of the first steps to not screwing it up as soon as you start animating, right? Because you may think, oh, this must be the control for this, and if you haven't checked out all those other controls yet, you're not really gonna know for sure, right? So let's look at the Hobo rig together. If you haven't downloaded it yet, up on the network, under the resources folder, so Greg, Anim Fund, resources, this Hobo folder. I left the original rig as it was in there, but the one we're going to be working with is Hobo Mystery. Now, don't double click on that file. What you're going to do, copy this whole thing somewhere to your computer. I know you know the drill. No, that's not what I want to do. Paste. Now the reason we're going to do this is because Hobo has an eye texture. There's a material in here under source images. It has this eye color and eye specular. And so if your character's eye isn't working, it's probably because you opened it incorrectly. So if you go to File, Set Project, and just select that Hobo, hit Set. Now we got to open it, File, Open Scene, Hobo Mystery. There we go. Now the first thing you'll notice is we're in a render cam that's locked, but we can go out of that. We can look at some other cameras. So there's 3 perspective cameras that already exist. First is just a perspective camera, where I can tumble around. Right. There's also a face GUI cam, face UI cam, which will put us over here on these facial controls. There's a reason there's a locked camera for this, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So how I usually like to do this is, depending on what your screen setup is right now, I like to maximize as much of my screen as I can to be able to interact with the character and to also see what the final animation is going to be. So let's just set something up like that really quick. Couple of options you might have, so you can kind of do this in your own way. If we go to panels and layouts, I usually do 2 panes side by side. Right? And then in one of these, I can have my render cam, and in the other one, I can have my perspective cam, right? And what that allows me to do is to move around in here. In fact, a lot of times in this camera, I'll just turn off everything under show. I'll go show none and then just show polygons. That way all I actually see is just sort of a rough version of what is going to render when it comes time to render. Right? This is what my camera is like. Yes?
My perspective short for wireframe running.
Yep, so you can have wireframe shaded or whatever on each of them. So just 4, 5, and 6. So if it's like that, then just 5 or 6.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, if yours looks like this is the shaded view, that's 5. And shaded is not going to show that eye texture. So if you tap 6, it will bring the material in there. Okay, and just to note this, I already kind of have this set up to where it should render pretty well. Wrong camera. There we go. I did a little bit of work on the materials to try to get it to work a little bit better in Arnold. I could get them better, but it was really cranking up the render time. As it is right now, I think this is rendering a little under a minute a frame, which isn't terrible. I can show you how to get it down a little lower if you're having issues with that. But that's for 1920 by 1080, and so I'm fine with this project if you want to render it at 1280 by 720. Is that what it is? Yeah. So give it a second or two here. So this is what we have for our character, and I'm going to go ahead and close this down, and we're going to talk a little bit about the controls. So he has multiple rings around him, right? And each of these like kind of have like a different set of translates or rotates and a different like function, really, right? So starting with the bottom here, we have multiple like placement controllers, right? This is how we are going to be able to move our character around. So if we choose this first one, this this hexagon thing going on here, you'll see that that's the global control, right? This is where you are going to move the whole character. That is not, like if we have our character jumping forward, we don't move that. Like that's not the control we use to move the character forward. Got students outside later. That's the control we use to place the character's like world, right? Let's say we wanted a tiny hobo versus a gigantic hobo. This is where I would use, I could import more than one and I could scale the whole thing and make a little bitty one or a gigantic one, right? Let's say I wanted this guy to start on the top of a mountain, right? And I wanted to make sure I positioned it perfectly. I would use that placement controller, this global controller, to move that character up there, right? The reason for that is then everything else is still at 0 and 1, right? We can say that my character's starting point, I can still zero them out to that global position. If we move that control when we're moving the character, then IK just becomes useless, right? IK doesn't even have a point anymore. The whole point of IK is that you can lock something in absolute 3D space, right? So for example, this control here, if I grab it on the bottom and I move it around and I pin it there, and I'm like, that's where I want him to land. Right there, right exactly there. Well, if I move this placement controller, it still moves that, right? So I don't want to adjust that. There are times where I want to put this in a very specific spot and make it stay there, right? So this is really, if you think about it, this is just a really squishy bouncing ball rig, right? It just also has some facial expressions and an eye. So with the bouncing ball, we had squash and stretch, right? We had, but that was really just one slider. We could squash it and stretch it up and down. What this has is the ability to sort of warp that squash and stretch, right? So if I want to have my character kind of kick forward, or if I wanted it to, you know, sort of hop upward a little bit, but still keep its head in the right position, I have a control on each end to kind of manipulate that, right? And then on top of that, I have this little bitty controller here that's going to allow me to tweak some of the shapes, right? And so that'll allow me to flatten out the character a little bit, or even sort of give it like the impression of like some stepping, right? So if I wanted it to land on the back part of its butt, I guess, and sort of roll forward, I could sort of animate that happening, right? So these are just really small controls that do that. Now, one of the things I will go back on that placement control and mention is we got our translates, we got our rotates, we got our global scales, and then look at all of this other stuff we have here. Right? So we have the face UI, we have the morphs UI, and we'll see that some of those things are turned off. Right? The face UI is turned on, and that means if I go over here to face UI and turn that off, the little face control goes off. The one that we may notice here is Morphs UI, and if I turn that on, you'll realize there's still more controls here, right? I am still able to completely, wait, how does this work? I haven't actually used this one before. Okay, I'm honestly not sure what this is. Oh, this is probably where we can make some custom morphs on this. Okay, so anyway, we can turn that off if we don't think we're gonna need it. All the extra controls are on. Like a lot of times people like to simplify what their rig looks like. So if I turn those off, you'll see the extra controls where those little tweak controls at the top and the bottom, this little thing here, right? And the only other thing I'm really seeing here is we have this res. This is how smooth our object is. So if I change this to high res on the model, you may not be able to see that much of a difference, but if I go to low res, you'll see it's much more faceted. The reason to have this control is if you're working on a slightly slower computer, you can set this to low res and you're able to animate and it doesn't slow down, right? You can still hit play and hopefully for the most part watch it in real time. Okay, so let's sort of walk up these controls in the body really quick. Again, we have sort of this bottom squash and stretch controller. It kind of controls the position of the bottom of the character. The top kind of controls the position of the top of the character. And so you can imagine that this middle one controls the position of the middle of the character, right? If we think about this, all this character is sort of this this bendy blob that we can warp, right? And so this will give us the option to really manipulate that and try to get this character into, word of the day, a good pose, right? We're looking for strong poses on this. We're going to set that back to mid so you can see that. So if I want my character to feel like it's looking up at something, like there's something happening above it, maybe it's something like this. Right? And if I want to give that just a little bit more dynamicness, I'll maybe get a little bit of rotation, a little bit of angles on this. And you can kind of see what this tweak pose is for right now. If we look at the bottom of our character, it's still kind of rounded. It doesn't really feel like it's touching the ground. If I take that tweak pose and raise that up, flatten it just a little bit, and then lower all of these controls, I can make it feel like it's sort of touching the ground a little bit more, right? Now, in the process of doing that, I know my other controls kind of went to the floor. That's all right. I guess there's a couple of ways we could have done that as well. We could have lowered it this way and then scooted these back up. So, I don't know. I'm all right with them kind of going to the floor a little bit, though. Now, you'll notice right here, we have this little control here. This is the tweak control, and it's just going to give us really subtle changes to the character. It's also going to allow us to kind of stay in that same pose and get a little bit of motion out of him. So let's say like he's kind of anxious while he's in this pose, then maybe we get just a little bit of this motion while he's waiting, right? And it still kind of keeps him in that same pose. It's just giving us a little bit of subtle change to that, right? Let's go ahead and put him back in something kind of more neutral. So, in terms of the face rig over here, this is why there's a whole separate camera for this. If I go to panels, perspective, and I go to Hobo face cam, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the environment just so you can see this a little better. We have a whole bunch of different controls in here, and they're all labeled relatively well. Eye global, you'll see that that's a rotation control and a move control. That means if you want to make him look a little sad, maybe you move it down just a little bit, right? If he gets he perks up, you can kind of raise it up, right? This will kind of change it roughly where it is on his entire body. You also have a little bit of rotation in that, but that's not how you're going to make the character look around. That's more like how you would make it favor a look to the right. So think about this. If somebody says something over here, my head does not stay perfectly still and my eyes just drift over there to look at them, right? Like my head kind of follows where my eyes are going. And I think that that's part of what this is for, is if your eye looks over, but your body doesn't sort of seem to shift to that a little bit, then it's going to feel like your character isn't really like involuntarily acting. It's going to feel a little mechanical. So we get a little bit of rotation on this. So what I like to think about is like a well-designed rig is designed with an animator in mind, right? And so if it's really done correctly, if you look at all of the channels in here, you'll say, why did they put that in there? They must have had a reason, right? Like scale just like that comes with every object you make, but you'll see in some of these other controls that scale and even rotate aren't there anymore, right? They left scale on here for a reason, and that's because you may want to make the eye get a little bigger or a little smaller, right? So this is more than likely, this is a well-designed rig. More than likely, if there's a control in there, it's because the rigging artist thought you might need that as an animator. That's why they are like very valued in any pipeline. If you have somebody who is capable of making a great rig, they will make the difference in like how quickly you get your work done. They make the difference on whether you get to go home at 5 o'clock and watch the next episode of Game of Thrones, or if you're working there till midnight, right? So these are really like important decisions that they're making. Eye direction. This is really going to be how your eye is looking around, right? Now, just thinking about animation, in case I forget to mention this later, our eyes rarely move in extremely slow motions, right? Like smooth motions. If you actually look at eye tracking charts, what our eyes do is they're just constantly twitching. Like they're just constantly everywhere. Right? And we call that eye darts. Like your eyes dart back and forth between stuff. If I'm looking at Dusty and then I switch to looking at Samira, right? What usually happens is my eyes do not just like drift across, right? They dart over and then my head catches up. Or my head starts this motion and then my eyes dart over to catch up with that, right? The reason for that is because if your eyes were constantly swimming everywhere, you would get motion sick, right? We're darting back and forth between focus to focus. So most eye motions happen in the space of about 2 frames, right? Like if I were darting from Dusty to Samira, that motion would happen in about 2 frames. 3 or 4 at the slowest. It's never going to happen over the period of 10 frames unless you're like passing out or something. So most of these little eye motions you're going to see are going to be like really quick little like darts around, right? So again, a well-designed rig, you'll notice, translate X and Y. there's no need for a translate Z because this control is sort of controlling the direction your eye is looking, right? So this is designed with the user in mind. This is designed to make you as an animator more productive. Right? So we get a little bit of this. This is also sort of that, like, how can I lean my character to look at stuff? There's a pupil control. Sort of change, like, you know, they get like, you know, terrified versus like, well, I guess that's more terrified versus like, I don't know what, focused. The iris shape is going to adjust that a little bit more. I can tell you, this is just a great rig. And then my favorite, like, bulge, like, you want to make them look a little like drunk, I guess. And scale, I don't know necessarily why we need that one. That one I can see using mainly for like a stronger pose. Like you ever see like the old Tex Avery, like the wolf in the bar, and then the pretty lady gets up on the stage and his eyes like do that like bulge out thing. I have a feeling that's probably what that's for, is to get that like exaggerated cartoon bulge. So here's something to notice. Some of these controls down here, upper lid shape, all of these, there's nothing in there for me to grab, right? Although I'm not a huge fan of this, I like being able to see everything at all times. What he's done here is that those don't show up until you need them, right? So currently this character doesn't have an upper eyelid, but as soon as we start to see one, those controls come into play and we're able to change the shape of it. We're also able to like do a little bit of like compression in this. This is more to fix stuff that may break. So like when you start getting stuff that's blowing through the model. Okay, so that's just the eyelid, right? Now we also need an eyebrow. And I think that this is interesting. So this is, you see how there's like a little bit of white poking out at the top there? That's what some of these are for, is to correct for that. So like this, let me redo that. So this upper lid compression, you can probably use it and maybe this to try to fix that little bit of mistake in there. So you got this eyebrow shape as well. It seems skeptical of what you're saying, right? Eyebrow shrink. So, and then this eyebrow fixer allows you to nudge it forward and back a little bit to fix it. So that's just the upper one. We also have one for the lower one. We can start. So it's like you don't need them until it's activated. Okay. So this is interesting though, because if we were to zero all of this back out, which I think is also another sign of a good rig, if I go in here, select everything here, and type 0 into the, number lock 0 into this, right? I have to grab some of these here that have multiple channels on it. There we go. And yeah, so little bits at a time, the rig will start to go back to its default pose, right? And then, of course, back here to my perspective, select all of this, type 0 into all that. And now we're pretty much back to our default character. Right? Okay. This is why I wanted you to play with it, is because when I handed you this, it wasn't that impressive, right? Like you're like, oh, it's neat, it's a blob with an eye. The thing that I think is most interesting about this is that just by moving that stuff around, you probably started to see emotions coming out of it, right? Like if I just take this character's, let's go in here into that face cam again, right? If I just take this upper lid, this upper eyebrow, lower that down a little bit, like, now what's he thinking, right? Is he skeptical? Is he like questioning, right? Like, is he mad, right? Is it a he at all? Is he mad now, right? So if you tell this character something and its response is something like this, right? We're starting to see like just natural things that we read as emotions, right? Interestingly enough, these emotions are not these facial expressions are not learned, right? From what all science can tell, at least. If you take people who are blind from birth, they still make the same facial expressions, right? Like it's surprised in every country, on every human, because we just have these sort of reactions in our face, right? A lot of these are ingrained, I guess, however you want to look at that, but that's why we can immediately recognize them, right? We can immediately recognize a smile versus sadness, right? And on top of all of that, we have years and years and years of experiencing those things, right? And so since we have those years of experiencing them, we bring our own emotional baggage to it, right? And so like this is actually like powerful stuff you're getting ready to. I feel like I should be one of the Harry Potter teachers, being like, do not go into this lightly. This is like you, because like you can very easily like that. Well, not every phrase. That is kind of what we're doing, right? Is we are going to start playing with people's emotions, right? Because just by watching me mess around with this rig, you started to think about it as having emotions, and it's just a bunch of pixels. That's cool though. That's what we're doing this for. And this is, all honesty, this is the most addictive part, right? This is the part that like will keep you coming back for more when Maya crashes at 3 a.m. before a project's due, right? Like that hope that someday you can say you worked on a Disney movie, that's not going to cut it. You'll be like, screw it, I'm going to go work at the Waffle House, right? Like no, like it's the fact that this is like a drug. Like this is extremely gratifying to be able to take this literally like lifeless blob, and we're going to try to get some emotions out of it, right? So to talk just briefly about acting, and you'll hear me go into this much more in character animation. The phrase that you'll hear me refer to the most, there's two of them that kind of say the same thing. Acting is reacting, right? If you put a character in an empty box with nothing around them, there's nothing to react to, it's going to feel very, very boring, right? Most acting is a reaction to a stimulus, right? And because of that, there is a sequential order to stuff, right? You remember we talked about overlapping action? But there's a sequential order to physical motion, right? That first arm of the pendulum has to move before the second arm of the pendulum knows to move, like it is like before that information travels down. The same thing happens with acting, right? So I always use Big Bird as an example because we all love Big Bird, right? Let's say I was just here talking to Katie, and Big Bird stepped in the back room or back door, right? If I'm talking and I go, Big Bird, right? That's not believable, right? For you to actually believe that action, I'm talking. I look up, I see Big Bird, I think about what I'm seeing, and then I react, Big Bird, and then I go and I hug Big Bird, and class is dismissed because me and Big Bird's gonna go hang out, right? That sequential order is see, think, do, right? You observe, you have to process that because we are thinking, feeling, living human beings, right? And then we react. If you react before you have time to think, if you react before you see, then it's not going to be believable, right? And that's something you're going to hear me harp on a lot, because really that is almost entirely the essence of acting. Everything else you already have, which is 18 plus years of life experience, right? What you bring to that is coming from you, right? You all have heartaches that have happened in your lives. You've all had joyful things that happen in your lives. There are things that we all have our own personal understandings of it, right? That's actually how communication works. Give me 1 second here to pull this up, because I have a little presentation I forgot to pull up. I'm pulling this out of another lecture, but I will use no. Okay, and play. Oh, switch it. Display settings. Okay, so communication, like this is the visual representation. I probably should just save these as a series of images, right? Communication is all we're doing. Like art is communication, right? All communication works this way. I have something in my head. I want to get it into your head, right? My firm belief is that is the only way to define art, right? It is a communication. We can have we can have arguments all day long. Is that art? Is that not art? Pollock threw paint at a wall. Like somebody pooped in a bucket and hung it up. Like, is that art? Whatever, right? Like, and that's fine. There's lots of navel-gazing conversations we can have there. My belief is that art is just another form of communication, and if we think of it that way, we can tell if we're doing a good job at it or not. Just like acting is just another form of communication. And so I have something in my head, which could be this emotion that I want to convey through my characters, right? Or it could be a sentence I'm writing for a poem, or it could be an acting piece I'm doing on a stage, right? Speaking of which, you all should go watch Rocky Horror at Johnson City Community Theater. There's some of our students in it. It is awesome. So, Apple is in my head. If I had a way, right, ideally I could like pull out a cord from my ear, plug it into your ear, pipe Apple straight into your head, right? I can't do that, right? And even if I could, there's still some baggage that comes along with your understanding of Apple. But the way communication works is first we have to take what is in our head and convey that into a signal, right? So it's in my head, I turn it into some form of signal to send to you, right? It could be text, it could be spoken words, it could be a picture, it could be an animation, whatever that is, I translate it from my head into a thing that I can transmit, right? Then it travels to you. So let's just take verbalizing as the way of saying that. Apple, right? I think about Apple in my head. What is Apple to me? There was a tree in my backyard when I was a kid. Had a perfect little cutout notch in it for my little 5-year-old butt to sit in. I could climb it, but all the apples were really tiny. So if you ate too many of them, they would give you diarrhea. That's how I learned what apple was, right? You probably learned it a different way, right? Every word has that. Like even the simplest word, like mom, right? Mom to me is Rhonda Alicia Marlowe. She's got blonde hair. Like I could tell you all day long about what that means to me. That doesn't mean we agree on that word. You define the word mom based off of your life experiences, just like you define the word apple. So I take what's in my brain, I convert that into a signal. Apple's in my brain, convert it to the word apple. 5 letters that we all have agreed on in society means apple. And I say apple, right? That travels through the air and goes into your ear, right? And you hear apple. And then from there, you translate that into your understanding of apple, right? So the problem with that is there is noise at every signal, right? Every step of this signal, there is something that can complicate this, right? My understanding of the word apple comes from that tree that was not in your life, right? The word apple traveling through the air to get to your ear is happening in this big echoey room or happening through some Dollar General headphones that you're listening to on YouTube right now, like whatever. And then when we translate that back into your head, that goes off of your life experiences, whatever it is that how you learned what apple was, right? And so art is communication. Communication is by like definition flawed, right? So the only way we can really, or the only thing we can really do to minimize this amount of noise is clarity. Clarity is not louder, right? It doesn't mean like if I'm trying to communicate this, I can scream apple louder at you, right? That doesn't mean you're going to understand that tree that was in my backyard, right? So louder is not repetition. I had an art director once, and he told me once he was going on vacation, and I showed him some animations. I'm like, while you're gone, what should I be working on? And he looked at it and he goes, make it better. And then he left. So, again, like I needed more clarification. So what we're going to talk about right now is what it is we're going to do in terms of communication for acting that makes it clearer, right? In a couple of days here, I give a pose that kind of dials this in, particularly for characters. I thought about doing it today. I think it's going to make more sense once we get it to a full character. But the principle that we use for that is, can anybody... which of the 12 principles do you think we're really focusing on for clarity of what we're trying to show to our audience? Appeal, maybe? Staging. Right? Staging is all about how do you show it to your audience in the clearest possible way, right? And so for us, in terms of staging, it's all about how we craft this pose for this little blobby dude, right? And it really can be a subtle difference between the eyebrow being a little lower or the eyebrow being a little higher, right? It's really subtle differences that are going to change this. Now the other thing, before I get started on making this little guy move, the other thing we're going to think about is process of this, right? I can't, like I have 24 frames on my timeline right now. If I extended this out to 100, right? That's 100 different images I got to make clear, right? And that's not easy, right? I can't just go like frame 1, is it clear? Frame 2, is it clear? That is one of the reasons animators predominantly work in the post-to-post process, right? We're going to leverage Maya's ability to get us part of a frame to do this, right? So post-to-pose means we're only going to look at specific drawings or specific images, right? And we're going to keyframe the entire character, that way we're in control of everything on that character. So I know we've kind of talked about this a little bit before. I'm going to go ahead and make some controllers to grab my character, right? Again, this is kind of neat. If you want to be able to see all of these things and you have 2 monitors, you can go to panels and tear off copy, and it'll tear that off, and you can drag it over into another window and use it there too. So that might be, what? You want? Oh, you just have the one. I think these two up front are the only two that just have one monitor. Yeah, that sucks. Yeah. I need a VR headset, just like animated. So, so the thing about this that's kind of complicated is there's a lot of controls, right? And like it would be a pain in the butt if I'm like, I'm gonna go through here and hold shift and select every control, right? Sometimes I could drag select and it looks like I got everything except for those controls that are hidden, right? So I still didn't select everything. Another reason that I just believe firmly that this is a good rig, he did it for us. So if we look at all of these things here, you'll see that he actually made selection sets for the different controls. I'm just going to use this one at the top, but there's also one for the body controls and the facial controls separate. So if I click that out, these are all of the controls that are on the entire rig. So that's how I can select all of them. You can use that, but what I like to do is just go up to custom and make me a button. So if I go to my script editor here, I'm going to do edit, clear all, and that's just so I can see it. Click the top one, hold shift, click the bottom one. And so now those two lines right there are my entire character selected. I can highlight them, middle click, and drag those to my shelf. Save script to shelf as a Mel script. And so now I have a little button there that I can select all of Hobo, right? I also, if you want to, you can always go to edit, just so you know what this is. And under shelves, you can label it. See if that, well, it's close. All Hobo. And that's going to select everything. Like if you decide you just want to do the face, you can do the same thing with just these face controls. And that way you can animate those two things kind of separately. But right now, I'm going to pose this character as if it's all one piece, right? And now that I have that, I can actually minimize this for space. Turn my environment back on. Okay. So, I know we kind of briefly talked about what is going to happen in this animation. It's probably worth going ahead and looking at it really quick now, just while we can, what this project is.
Hey Greg, I have a question. When you're doing animations for like a company or whatever, do they give you an idea of what they want you to do, or do you get to make it up?
Well, sometimes both. So the question was, if I'm working for a company, do they give me an idea of how they want it to look or do, or what they want the character to do, or do I make it up? Different companies, different projects give you more leeway than others. So like for the leaders for Civ 5 and Civ 6, they would give me the character, they would tell me who the character was, like the character's personality, right? Which is an important part we really haven't mentioned, right? Like Hobo could be a bold hero, or Hobo could be a scared, like, little kid, right? However you want to portray them. So they would tell me who the character is, and then they would tell me which animations we need. We need an animation where the character declares war on the player, and then they would let me take a stab at figuring out how what the animation should look like. And usually I would shoot reference for that and send it to them. And then they would comment on that performance. They'd be like, maybe make it a little angrier, or maybe make it a little like he's moving too much, right? Like those sort of comments. Occasionally the art director or the animation director has a very specific performance in mind, and in that case they sort of reserve that right to take over and say do it exactly like this, and I'm cool with that. But that is kind of the workflow. Occasionally though, like it's a smaller studio, they're not even thinking about animation, and they sort of give all of that to the animator, and they're like, just make us some cool stuff, here you go, right? And those are really fun, because then you can do like your own thing and kind of just run with it. So, So our project, did that answer the question?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
So our project, if you haven't sort of read ahead on this, we're just going to animate Hobo. The actions of a living creature are most often reactions to stimuli, acting as reacting. And it's up to us as animators to create an illusion of that reaction that gives the viewer an indication that the creature or character has the ability to think and make decisions. Right? So using the Hobo rig, we're going to animate the character approaching a box cautiously. He's going to look at it, and then he's going to jump back in surprise, disgust, or horror. It's your call, right? When I initially wrote this, I was thinking an open box, and then when I started modeling the scene, I was like, I'll give it a little glowing box. You're welcome to change that part up. That box is not a requirement. If you want to make a little cardboard box and put some Halloween blood and guts in there, that's on you. Or if you want to make it a birthday present that's got a skunk in it, like whatever is your whim, right? The final rendered file is due Tuesday, October 23rd, 2018. I don't know if that's true anymore. Let me look at that, because that was last class period. So that is not true. So I wrote that a long time ago. Yeah, so we're looking at the 25th. No, I think we're going to push that back. I think we're going to get a week on it at least. So yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So anyway, I just wanted to look at that. Basically, he's cautiously hopping in and then reacting to whatever it is he sees in this box. Okay. So so those are notes that we can do, and so are notes that we can kind of address when we're thinking about how to animate this, right? And so as silly as this is going to sound, the first thing you should probably do is get reference. So if you have some friends that look like this, we can get reference for things that are completely not like us at all, right? Like we can figure out how this little guy moves, put your hands in your pockets, put your feet together, and hop around and try to see how you would do it. How would you look at stuff, right? And that's like, you don't look like this guy, this thing, this creature. But you may be able to pull, well, you will definitely be able to pull information about how you did that and translate that into how this creature will do this, right? So I don't want to go through the entire process because, frankly, watching another person animate is boring, right? Whenever we're at parties or anything, people will ask what I do, and I'm like, I animate. And they'll say, oh, that's so exciting. And my wife always says, no, it's not. It's really boring. So I'm not gonna make you watch me animate this character. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just do a few keyframes in here just to show you the process, and then kick you out of the nest and let you go sort of make your own, right? So the method to this is to set a keyframe on the entire rig as if you were drawing it, right? So how many of you have done some form of 2D animation in the past, right? Which is, like, you can't do, like, if you're doing 2D animation, like, you don't, like, go to the first piece of paper and draw, like, the left foot, and then go to the second piece of paper and draw the left foot again, right? You draw the entire character as a pose. That is why we say pose to pose, right? Is that we're going to draw that entire pose with this rig. Right? We're going to morph this thing around until we get that entire pose. And then we're going to go to the next key storytelling pose, and we're going to pose it there and think of that as a drawing too. We're going to freeze all of that. We're going to set a keyframe on all of that. So let's just start by having him kind of jump in. Again, let me zero some of this out. There we go. Okay. So starting on frame 1, I'm going to go ahead and select all of Hobo and hit S. I like to work with auto key on. You are your own person, so you can do this however you want to do it. And I'm going to go ahead and sort of get him in his starting pose. Now, this will be the only time I'll use this control to kind of place him. So I'll start here, I'm gonna make him sort of favor the camera just a little bit so we get a clearer view of that eye. And then I'm gonna go in here and start mashing some of this stuff down and getting him into a pose that is not my default pose here, right?
Greg?
Yes.
When you begin an animation, do you have to leave like a second or two of just nothing before they start moving?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually a great question. So the question was like, when you begin an animation, do you leave a second or two of them doing nothing before you get started? Generally, I do. It's not always true in every shot, but the way to remember this is your eye. Like if I completely like switch to a different view, like I'm sitting here right now looking at the back of the room. If I quickly turn and look over here, like to this side of the room, that switch in perspective, my eye takes about half a second to focus and track and find everything in that scene, right? So if you start on frame 1 and your character is already taking off, the audience may miss that, or at least they'll feel like they missed that, right? So yeah, I usually leave, they call them handles, like little handles on the end of each of the beginning and the end of the shot. And if later in editing you trim some of that off, that's okay. But yeah, probably about a second or so before it really starts moving, I would probably like ease into that a little bit. So that is a good point. I'm starting this off in sort of a neutral-ish pose. Like it's not neutral, it's just a starting, like the character existed before this shot pose, right? Now to me, when I'm posing this, like anything that is parallel, anything that is like straight, like anything that like feels perfect is boring, right? Like if we think about that, like two parallel lines is way less interesting than two curved lines or two jagged lines, right? I don't necessarily know the psychology behind that. I'm sure somebody does, but we find curves and angles more impressive than straight lines. But when this character was made, it was easier to model and it was easier to rig if everything was sort of even, right? The first thing we're going to do is sort of mess that up a little bit. We're going to go in here and find ways of making this pose just a little more dynamic, something like this. I always like to get some angles in here, get a little bit of rotation in here, right? Sort of your call about what you want to do. So maybe I'll make him, I'm starting him off cautious, so maybe I'll start off a little bit like this. And then I'm also going to go in here and sort of play with this eye a little bit and sort of get him looking at that box, right? Maybe just for a little bit of, just a touch more of appeal, I'm going to pull this out, just sort of play around with this and see if there's a different shape that I can get, right? And in terms of the eyebrows and eyelids, I'm going to move those down just a little bit. Probably do the eyelid more. I'm also going to do the lower lid a little bit. And then let's see if I can make this a little bit like going curious. I kind of feel like that's feeling. He does, doesn't he? I feel like that looks angry. So let's go more like there. And I want to push this out just a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and just try starting there. Now, just in general, when posing an eyelid, we've been staring at this character with his eye like super wide open, like from the very beginning, and we kind of get used to that. If you, like next time you're talking to somebody and looking in their eyes, you'll notice that you usually don't see any white over their pupil, unless they're surprised. So ideally, I usually try to make this upper lid sort of touch the top of that, because this will start to seem surprised, right? All I have to do is, like, if I want him to seem surprised, I can just sort of raise that up just a little bit, maybe raise this down just a little bit, and suddenly he gets a little bit more surprised. So I'm going to start it off something like this, and this also gives me a place to go. Like it gives me some place to progress forward with the confusion. Again, all of those keys probably auto-keyed, but just to be safe, this is my starting pose. I'm going to hit S, set a keyframe on that, and then I'm going to give just a little bit of time for the character to kind of lean forward for this next pose, right? So I want to show curious, and so my thinking is like, if you've already seen something and you want to show that it's curious, you kind of lean in and get a little closer, right? So I'm going to lean him in just a little bit here on our next pose, which I think I'll make just for sake of an attempt here. I'm going to try frame 20, okay? So I like to go ahead and set a keyframe just to make sure I got one on everything. And then I'm going to kind of lean it in just a little bit. Squash it a little bit. And I'm going to mess with this eye a little bit too to make sure he's still looking at that. I want to try to make this eyebrow seem a little bit more curious here. Bring this up just a little bit. And rotate this back just a little bit like that. I want to get a little bit more of a curve in there. What does this do? Yep, that does it. And just to make sure I'm still kind of like where my camera can see everything, I'm going to angle it just a little bit to the camera. Even if he's not looking exactly at the box, as long as it feels like he's looking at the box, that's really the important part. So maybe about there. I think I can do something with his bottom lid. And what does some of this stuff do again? Let's try that. Let's try pushing that forward just a little bit. Yeah, I want to shrink that just a little bit. Okay, so the thing I want you to notice is I'm thinking of the whole pose. For me, that includes all of the facial features, and particularly in this character because they're such a dominant part of the pose. One of the biggest mistakes I see most people make when they start animating is they say stuff like, I'll animate the hands later. Or I haven't, yeah, you've seen that before. What that means is you get to the end of the animation and your entire animation is your character doing this and you have nothing on the hands, right? If you just start posing the hands, like you may not have to make major changes on every pose, but if you hit the big poses, Maya's going to give you some stuff for free, and it's going to feel more alive, right? So go ahead and pose all of that. Another trap that you'll fall into is thinking that you need to figure out one part of the character all the way through first, right? Maybe you're like, oh, but I need to figure out where the placement of the bottom piece is all the way through. No, we can work on that later. Right now we're thinking as a single drawing to a single drawing, right? And the way I usually do that is I use the greater than, less than keys to step back and forth between this and say, does this look like the character goes from back here curious looking to up here curious looking, right? It's not bad. But to me, it could definitely be stronger. And this is why I do this, is because if I start scrubbing, I'm going to think about, oh wait, his eyebrow's doing something weird there, and like he looks too squishy, I need to make more poses, right? No, I just need to think about this pose and this pose. One of the ways you can do that is if you right click and turn on Enable Step Preview. For some rigs that will work well. I honestly don't know if Hobo is one of them. Let's see. It is not. So let me explain why that happens. Enable Step Preview sets all of your curves in your graph editor to stepped mode, which means there's no transition. Some of the curves in the graph editor for this rig are driving parts of the rig. Right, so maybe there's like a set-driven key or something like that. And what just happened is it flattened out those set-driven keys and broke the rig. There's a way that we can manually set this to stepped, which is just going into the graph editor. So let me undo this. I gotta scrub and it'll fix it. There we go. So if I just select all of this, I go into the graph editor and set all of these keys here to stepped mode. It's not going to grab the set-driven keys, and now I only get to see those two poses. That is a good way of working. I would honestly encourage it during the posing process. In character animation, I always do my blocking and my posing pass in stepped mode, or at least just use that greater than, less than keys to step back and forth. Now, sometimes it's a little bit of a pain in the butt because you may go make your next key and it may not make it in stepped mode. But this allows me just to focus on these two things and not worry about the way it's transitioning. And that's really good because I'm already noticing problems. To me, the change between here and here doesn't feel like an interesting pose change, right? So maybe what I'll do is I would actually start the character a little further back. That way that feels a little more interesting. Right? The cool thing to me too is I also now have this option in the middle here to sort of dip the character's head forward, right? When I start animating this here in a minute, or when I start splining this here in a minute, the character is just going to go from pose to blend straight into the next pose. I want to build in an arc of the character sort of leaning in, right? So that's probably what I'll do here in a minute. Now you'll get to poses like this, and if that's my only pose there, my character is going to lean forward, hit that pose, and then go immediately to the next pose. Right? What I need instead is I need a little bit of time for this character to just kind of hang out in this pose. Right? I want it to kind of stay here a little bit. We call this a moving hold. Right? The character is going to hit this pose, and then I want it to stay there for maybe 10 or 15 frames. Right? So what I'm going to do is select all of this, hit S again, and kind of push it just a little bit more. You'll definitely hear me talking more about this later. It's very easy to feel like this is big enough, right? But if you keep pushing it, you'll notice it doesn't feel broken, right? Like sometimes my assumptions of how much I can push a pose are incorrect, right? I'm underestimating what will be believable. Right? And so if you just push it a little bit more, you're possibly going to like it more, right? So don't just go with your first instinct on it. So I'm going to push the character a little bit more, maybe play around with that eyebrow a little bit. Oh, wrong one. And so you'll see that it's not a major, let's do That's kind of neat. Let's do a little bit of compression on the top too. You'll see it's not a major change here. Between these two poses. But now it's going to continue to feel like he hits this pose, and then we get 10% more of that pose, right? He just pushes it just a little bit more. And if I play that now, it kind of feels like he leans in, right? So that's a moving whole. If I didn't have that, what's going to happen is he would lean in and then immediately go to the next pose, right? Now what we need in animation is we never need anything to stop moving. Like everything is always moving just a little bit, unless it's like locked down by something else. So like your foot may stop moving because it's on the floor, but you know, like if you're free floating, free moving, it's always going to move just a little bit. So so that's what I'm putting in there. I'm going to just do maybe 2 more quick keyframes. I'm going to have my character sort of go into an anticipation, just go back up a little bit into an anticipation, and it's going to sort of jump, right? So I'll do these a little faster, because I know this is not super exciting to watch, just so you can kind of get some examples, right? So leans in. I'm going to have him anticipate back pretty quickly. So select all. It's going to be the opposite. For this, I'm going to have him blink. How do I make him blink? It's this one. So you can kind of see like it messed up my, it's no longer in stepped mode. So I can always just go back in here, select everything, and set that back to stepped mode. So I need to make sure this is playing real time. It is not. There we go. So anticipate back. I don't like that. Need to move this forward a little bit. Maybe move this forward just a little bit. Okay, so there's his anticipation down. I want to show you a quick keyframe, or not a quick setting you can change. You'll notice that when I'm scrubbing in my timeline, I'm only seeing the update in this one until I release my timeline. And to me, that's something ridiculously annoying. Like I want to be able to see an update in both of them. If I go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, under Time Slider, I can scroll down here and it's Update View, and right now it says Active. If I set that to All, it will update on all of them. I also usually increase my Time Slider height right there, and occasionally I'll increase my key tick size as well, just so I can see this a little more easy. This is where I do most of my work, so I may as well maximize as much of this as I can, right? And so now it's going to update in both of them. Anticipation down. I want to have him kind of go quickly into that push off, maybe right there. Select all. So he's going to push off to jump. You're going to see a lot of this stuff is going to be kind of messed up now, right? So I got to get my character back to something neutral. If I'm ever having issues with this, sometimes I'll just go here, zero this out, and that way I kind of have a fresh control position and sort of start over from scratch. There we go. And of course I have this weird thing happening down here. I can adjust that. What does this do? I didn't even try this. Body wave. That's weird. Body scale. Oh, that's interesting. So there's an extra thing that we can, I don't know what that is. Change. So there we go. I'm going to get his face back open here a little bit. And that's probably way too big of a stretch and way too forward of a stretch. There we go. So last two keys I'll do kind of quickly. I'm going to do his landing. So keyframe on that. And the reason is because it's kind of easy to figure out the landing because I'm already in one stretch pose. I can kind of do a second stretch pose over here. Notice I'm not moving this controller. I'm leaving that where it is. I'm moving this controller. And getting sort of another stretch over here. Testing some stuff to see what we get. Okay. I kind of want him to feel like he's kind of coming in, looking at this thing. Contact on the floor, right about there. Maybe a little bit more eyebrow work. Go back and see if I did anything interesting here. Yeah, it's looking better. That's weird looking. And then somewhere in the middle here, I'll do my up pose. Just to make it make sense, I'm going to go ahead and have him sort of go back to a similar neutral pose here on his landing. So here. So to move the whole character, I really just have to grab this top pose, or this top one and this bottom one to get them into a completely different pose. And again, I'm always playing it to this camera, right? Can't stop there. I have to get a little bit of a squash on that. There we go. So all the controls, open this back up. There we go. So, again, I know it's not super fun to watch another person animate. Hopefully by watching some of that, you get some ideas of what I'm going for. So what I'd like to try is I could keep working and show you the rest of the process, but doing the entire animation like this is the first thing your art director would ask for, right? They would say, well, this is the second thing I'd ask for. They would, Katie asked a minute ago, they would say, do the declare war animation. I would shoot reference. I would sort of get that approved as a performance. And then I would do my blocking pass. And I would send them a video in stepped mode like this, right? So what I'd like to try is by next class period, let's see if you can get all of your stepped mode version of this done, okay? So that's not a gradable assignment. Like we're going to, that's more of a check-in date. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this file that I've worked on here, and I will pick it up in the next class period to show you the next few steps. I will give you sort of a, in case you get even further ahead and want to keep practicing at this, right? Save a version of it before you do this. But my next step is figuring out what happens in between these poses, right? So like I said earlier, I have this first pose, right? And then my next pose is this. Maya is going to give me an answer. Maya is going to try to do a transition over those other 18 frames, right? I've given it 1 and 20. It's going to try to figure out the rest of it. And Maya is going to be wrong, right? Maya is going to give me the most generic, boring answer possible. My job as an animator is to make it less boring. Okay? That process is called breakdowns. Although we can do this in the graph editor, I'm not really going to be done setting keyframes yet. I'm going to set a couple more keyframes to describe how the character gets from pose A to pose B, right? So if we're starting here, it goes to here, right? That's a very simple change that literally has an infinite number of different ways it could happen. Literally. Like, I'm not one of those people who doesn't actually understand the meaning of the word literally. Literally. And your job as an animator is to figure that out. That's where the creativity comes in. If we're going to let Maya do this, it's going to give us the same answer every time. It's going to use math and figure out a straight line, right? We're going to figure out something more interesting. And so that's what we're going to, for the next step of this, is creating additional keyframes that we call breakdown keys. Some people call this blocking plus, this next stage. So if you want to try that, you can. What I would say is less is more at this point. Set enough keyframes to where if you peck on the shoulder of the person next to you and hit play like this, they kind of understand what's happening, right? If I go downstairs and I got Marty to come up here, I got Radina to come up here, whoever, right? And I let them watch this, they should be able to say, he's curious about that box and he jumps forward, right? Now, if that pose with the character up in the air wasn't there, they would be like, he's curious about that box and he slid forward, right? That means I didn't have enough key poses in there. So that's what you're going for, is enough key poses to where you've described this motion visually, right? To where you have taken it out of your brain, converted it, sent it across, and the next person can interpret that in the clearest way possible, or hopefully correctly. And the way you do that is you make these poses as clear as possible. Right? So is this making sense? Remember when I said I could talk a lot? So what we have now, about 2 hours? No, I think it's about an hour and a half. Actually, an hour and 24 minutes and 12 seconds. So I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to save this file. We're going to let you have the rest of the class to just do whatever you want to. It's about another hour left in class. And if your answer for that is, I'm leaving, I get that. What I will say is, like, we need to decide exactly on the due date of this project. It's not next class period. So don't sweat it too much. Depending on how next class period goes, we'll determine whether it's going to be a week from today or the following Tuesday. I'm kind of leaning toward the following Tuesday if this is a project you're excited about. How many of you are kind of enthused about this one? All right. If you're like halfway through it and you're like, this is really boring, I'm not going to drag you. Like I want you to get the most out of it. So what I would try to say is, yes, I've already told you how it's going to move. He's curious and then he gets scared or grossed out or whatever. Your job now is to make that interesting. Like that is sort of the challenge of being an animator, right? In the past I've given an assignment. No, in the past I've gotten assignments that really just were not exciting, right? And so I can either sit there and do it and hate my life, or I can find a reason to get excited out of it. So what I would say is like, what for you would make this exciting? How will you take this and like when you're making this, think about when we walk around the room next class period and we watch them. Think about trying to make us laugh. Think about trying to make us go, oh, cool, right? Like that is your goal, right? Is to make the audience say, oh wow, that's awesome, or oh that's really neat, right? Or make them just literally start laughing. Don't spend too much time on the gag. Like try to do that with the actual quality of the animation. Like if the gag takes so much setup that it ends up taking all of your time, you're kind of focusing on the wrong thing. Like is it a weird little like head shake, or is it the way the character throws his head forward to jump? Like come up with some ideas that's going to make this appealing, right? Another one of the 12 principles. So. All right, cool. Any questions on this? Yes.
Does he have to jump? Or
he doesn't have to. I would say that like jumping means that you can show some weight, and I think it makes it a little bit more of an impressive piece to be able to show that physicality of it. But if you would rather, are you thinking more like a wobble, or are you wanting to start a clip? Oh, a roll. Ooh. So the interesting question with a roll is still think about the word curious, right? So is it a Mission Impossible like like does it like a shoulder roll, or is it just like a roll for fun's sake and try to give it a reason to happen the way it stays? Yeah, I think that's a great example. Like he has the ability to do a weird little wobble forward too, right? He has that little control under there that you can kind of fake some feet. So. All right, cool. I'm going to go ahead and stop the video and hop around and answer questions. And so thanks for bearing with me for 1 hour and 27 minutes and 30 seconds.